those of you who are joining us for the first time, this program is put on by our office, which is called the Nat Sci Center for Community Inclusion and Belonging, or the CICB is what we call it. And so without further ado, I won't hold you up there. I'm just really excited for you all to be here tonight, especially our panelists and our moderator this evening, but I don't want to hold us up too much. And so I'm going to turn it over so we can begin our program with our land acknowledgement.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kendra Pyle. My pronouns are she, her. I am a graduate assistant in working with Dr. Benton in the Center for Inclusion, Community, and Belonging in the College of Natural Science. And I'm going to start us off with the land acknowledgement. We collectively acknowledge that Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on lands ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, for Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Michigan State University more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Benton for the opening remarks.
Oh, I didn't. We're gonna have more. I would have said my earlier remarks. But this month is very, very special, and I really have said all my opening remarks earlier to all of you. But this month is really special. Once again, we are celebrating Native and Indigenous voices, and I think that's something that we don't often hear about enough in STEM. We all know there are many people who are underrepresented within the STEM community, and so I just feel really honored that we had 4 people who really agreed to share their stories and experiences with us all tonight. And so I encourage us all to be open and be curious. And I hope that we are all here to learn. And again, I just appreciate the opportunity to learn a little bit more about people's contributions to STEM, as well as their personal and professional experiences. And hopefully there's information that we can all take back with us about how we can do better about supporting Native and Indigenous, not just students, but also our professionals who might also be engaging in the STEM community. And so again, thank you. And yeah, that just keep it brief. So I'll turn it back to you, Kendra.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Benton. I just wanted to give a brief history of Native American Indigenous Heritage Month. So during the month of November, Americans celebrate Native American Indigenous Heritage Month to honor the cultures, traditions, histories, and accomplishments of Native peoples. This Heritage Month was started in 1990 when President George H.W. Bush approved a joint resolution designating the month of November as a National American Indian Heritage Month. In proclaiming Native American Indigenous Heritage Month for 2021, for this year, President Biden said, "We celebrate the countless contributions of Native peoples, past and present, honor the influence they have had on the advancement of our nation, and recommit ourselves to upholding trust and treaty responsibilities, strengthening tribal sovereignty, and advancing tribal self-determination." President Biden also said Native American roots are deeply embedded in this land, a homeland loved, nurtured, strengthened, and fought for with honor and conviction. This month and every month, we honor the strong and enduring cultures and contributions of all Native Americans and recommit ourselves to fulfilling the full promise of our nation together. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dakota Jackson to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, and again thank you for joining us tonight. Ani, Bojo, Dakota Chajakos Dishnakas, Wikwemkong Donjaba. Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Dakota Jackson, and I am from the Wikwemkong Unceded Indian Reserve in Ontario, Canada. I am a 2018 graduate of MSc, where I majored in biochemistry and molecular biology with a post-baccalaureate training in molecular bio. And I plan to pursue a professional degree in medicine. And today I have the special privilege of introducing our panelists. I'll start with Bidoske. Bidoske Stonefish comes from the Ottawa, Chippewa, and Delaware and Potawatomi tribes. She was born and raised on the Grand Traverse Band of Indian Reservation in Peshawar Town, Michigan. She also comes from the Quechua First Nation in Walpole Island, Ontario, Canada. Bidoske is a first-generation college student and graduate of Michigan State University in the class of 2020, where she received her Bachelor's of Science in Human Biology. She's currently serving in the Open MSU AmeriCorps Vista program as an opioid resource specialist with the Intertribal Council of Michigan and Open MSU. After her year of service, Biroska aspires to pursue a career in medicine and use her background and experiences to improve healthcare in Indigenous communities. Biroska, thank you for joining us tonight. Dr. Red Dog Sina is of mixed Greenlandic, Inuit, Danish, Irish, and Prussian Jewish heritage and culturally identifies as Indigenous. He is a 2009 graduate of the Michigan State University College of Osteopathic Medicine and completed residencies in family medicine and osteopathic neuromusculoskeletal medicine, or ONMM for short. He's an assistant professor in the MSU COM Department of Osteopathic Manipulative Medicine. In addition to clinical practice, he teaches the MSU ONMM residency program and the Osteopathic Medical Scholars 3+4 Professionalism Seminar Series. He is working with COM to recruit more students from underrepresented backgrounds in medicine and has just begun a term as the Vice Chair for MSU COM Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Dr. Sina, thank you for joining us today too. Last and certainly not least is Avery Tilley. Avery is an undergraduate junior pursuing dual degrees in fisheries and wildlife with a concentration in pre-veterinary medicine and molecular genetics and genomics at Michigan State University. And Avery is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. He's interested in the effects of wildlife health and disease across a variety of conservation issues, including species reintroduction, captive management, eco-immunology, human-wildlife conflict, and public engagement. His current research has investigated the role of white-tailed deer in understanding the spatial components of West Nile virus. In addition, he has developed eDNA assays for special species of tribal concern and has worked extensively on the efficacy of new drug treatment in treating abomasal nematodes in captive hoof stock. After graduating from MSU, Avery will pursue a doctorate of veterinary medicine focusing on wildlife disease pathology and conservation medicine with the eventual goal of bettering the profession of conservation medicine. Avery, thank you for joining us tonight as well. So tonight, we have prepared questions ahead of time for panelists, including questions that participants have included on the registration form. And the first question tonight is, how did you decide to pursue an education and career in STEM? Biroska, we will start with you.
Biroska, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and share, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, so I decided to pursue an education in STEM. I think early on, I was about 8 years old when I attended my first traditional birth, and that really sparked my interest in the human body. And the traditional birth actually happened in my hometown in Peshabi town. And I think that's always been in the back of my mind, my curiosity in the human body, and just understanding that I, have to study science to learn more about it. I also, like, going throughout high school, my favorite subject was math, and I knew I wanted to go to college, but when I got to college, I had no idea what I wanted to study. And I honestly didn't think I was smart enough to study STEM. I didn't have enough courage to pursue a STEM major. So I don't know, I just kind of started taking my classes, and then I joined NASO, and in NASO I met two of my dear friends that I have now, and they were both STEM majors. And I think that really gave me like the extra boost of courage that I needed to pursue that degree. And it ended up being a really good fit, and I ended up finishing my degree. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Biroska. Dr. Sina?
So I think I decided to go into STEM finally when I was about 37. I had been teaching writing at a bunch of different schools around the country, and I'd been I taught at Michigan State for 5 years. And during those last couple of years, I realized that I really wasn't doing something that I wanted to be doing. And I really was teaching about healthcare inequity. And I decided that instead of teaching about it, I was going to try and do something to address it. And so not that long after my wife and I married, I said, well, I'm going to quit my job and go to school. And she said, okay. And so then I started taking pre-med classes because I was an English major in undergrad. And my PhD is in English. It just seemed to make sense. And so I think that for me, I might not have been able to do it if it hadn't been for my discovery of osteopathic medicine. I should say for having discovered it for myself. It was already there. But that allowed me to study science in a way that I think is very different from what a lot of science education is now. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later.
Thank you, Dr. Sina. Avery?
Osio, Avery Dawadoa, Ayachichalaji. Hi, everyone. It's really nice that you're all on today. And I just want to echo what the other two panelists have said. Definitely goes back to just like kind of that like flip of the switch moment, or like kind of those experiences. For me, it was always like being outside in the natural world. Did some hunting on the reservation frequently when I was younger. And I really like kind of attribute that to like kindling my passion for natural resources and kind of for wildlife in general. And then kind of as I've progressed, wildlife disease has just become a bigger and bigger topic, right? I mean, COVID-19, these spillover events, right, of diseases from animals coming in and impacting human lives. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done in that field. And so that is kind of why I have chosen to pursue it.
All right, thank you, everybody. I'll move on to our next question. And this could be answered in any order by the panelists. The next question is, how have your cultural heritages and traditions impacted your academic and professional path? I welcome any of our panelists to begin this one.
I can start. So my cultural heritage and traditions deeply impacted my academic path, just because, as I said earlier, attending like these traditional ceremonies is really what made me realize that these processes are indigenous. And then hearing my grandma growing up would always tell us, like, we've always been scientists, because like we knew like hair was our DNA, and in our culture our hair is really important to us. And so hearing that growing up, that like we've always been scientists and we always knew about these scientific processes, that really is vital in why I decided to study science. And going through my process, or like going through education and academia, it was really hard for me sometimes. You know, it's like a totally different world than the world I grew up in, and being a first generation college student. So my heritage and my cultural traditions is really what kept me going and kept me grounded. And now it has a huge impact on the work I do as an AmeriCorps Vista member, helping to build capacity with the Intertribal Council of Michigan. And part of my work is supporting pregnant and breastfeeding mothers that use opioids. And that's a huge part of our culture is, you know, when you're carrying a baby or when you're breastfeeding, that's like really sacred to us. And a lot of our body and our processes are really sacred. So I think that my cultural heritage and traditions is something I carry with me in my everyday life, both in academia and my work, just every day. So it has a huge, huge impact on my path.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo that as far as like almost to go so far as like everything in my academic like career so far has like tied back to my heritage. Like if I like see something or watch something or complete an assignment, I always find myself like tying it back or like looking at it through an indigenous lens. And I think that's really, really important. I will kind of like say as well though, like kind of in the wildlife disease world, and I don't know if Dr. like Sina has experienced this in medicine or not, but sometimes there can be like some cultural apprehension there, or I'll use the word like taboo aspects, especially with the Cherokee people, as far as like health and disease and kind of those topics and who can like apply that and understand. So there's been some like setbacks there too, as far as like convincing my grandparents and like that this is a field of that is important and what this can mean like to the tribal community as a whole. And so, but at the same time, even though there's like barriers there, I think it's really cool to see how I can overcome those by also like tying it back in. It kind of comes full circle in a sense, as far as like whenever kind of like what Bodoske said, like you'll the Cherokee have always kind of dealt with certain diseases out in the reservation, and like what we have known about those and passed on is like still true today to how wildlife managers manage for those diseases. And so I think it's kind of just pulling both those together and seeing where your connections are and moving forward from there.
So I think that every day that I'm practicing medicine, I'm actually doing it in a cultural space that feels like it's very much what my mother taught me. Like Avery and Bodoska, I mean, I was raised to have a sense of the world, that everything's related, that everything fits together, that there is spirit in everything. And those are really kind of fundamental philosophical concepts in osteopathic medicine too. And I think that some of this has been written, some of this has been inferred, that Andrew Taylor Still, the person who is responsible for naming osteopathic medicine, was of Cherokee heritage. And he spent a lot of formative time during his training and then later working with Native people in Wakarusa Mission, Kansas. His father summoned him to be the physician to the Shawnee. And I think that his time spent with the Shawnee and the fact that he spoke Shawnee fluently shaped the way he approached medicine. And it allowed him to bring the spiritual into the practice of medicine in a way that wasn't done anywhere else in the Western world, really, not on a systematic way. And so for me, that's sort of what I carry with me every time I'm in a room, every time I'm working with somebody.
Thank you, panelists, for your input on the last couple questions there. Kendra, I will turn it over to you.
All right, the next question I'm going to go ahead and paste into the chat also. What advice would you give to future Indigenous students who are interested in studying and working in STEM? And with the rest of the questions, whoever would like to answer them first, you're welcome.
I guess my advice would, I guess with my advice, it would just go back to kind of like, make sure that it is your passion, and however you want to like figure that out, whether it's, you swing by, a veterinarian office and chat with a veterinarian and see if that's something you enjoy, or you see if you can, head over to a chemistry lab. I don't know what it might be for those students, but I think just trying to nail down that is what that career could look like for you, and what your future in said STEM field would look like for you is really important, because if you don't have the passion there, then I think, especially in STEM, burnout is easy and quick, especially in academia, especially if you're in a school far from home. So I would just encourage them to kind of make sure they have that passion, and that would definitely be the first step.
I agree with Avery. I think that's very important to have that passion. And also, I want to talk a little bit more about something he said about like building those connections. And like if you're far from home, it's really important. I think something that weighed really heavy on me was being part of that less than 1% of the population that is in STEM. And that was really hard on me. And that was really something I struggled with. And I wasn't too far from home, not as far from home as Avery, but I was a good 3.5 hours from home when I started studying at MSU. And I think it's really important to really build relationships with people. And I know it's hard, like you're young, you're shy, and but I think it's really good to, like I said, I made friends in NASO, which is the North American Indigenous Student Organization. And so I kind of started there. And then each year I kind of went out of my shell a little bit more, and I started building more relationships with community members and faculty and staff. And that was really hard for me. But I think, like, especially when you're far from home and you're dealing with burnout, it's really important to reach out to people and to take care of yourself in that way, and make sure you have people to talk to and build those connections. That's some advice I would give.
I think the thing that I would add is to make sure that people find out that everybody starts not knowing anything about the area they're going to study. Because I don't like to call it imposter syndrome. And I think it's actually now become fashionable to say, I don't like calling it imposter syndrome. But I think that when you don't have a lot of role models available, it's really easy to get overwhelmed by that and feel like you're taking on the mantle before you've even done anything. And so for me, I had a cousin who was a physician, and all she'd do is call me periodically and just check in on me. And I knew a few other people who had gone through, and every once in a while they would check in on me. And so then it became my job to check in on other people. And then those people's job will be to check in on other people. And that's how we will build the network that allows us to do to pass the 1%. Every applicant I've spoken to that we've accepted to the medical school, when I talk to them, and I hope I don't get in trouble for saying it, but I say to them, they need to go where they're going to be successful. I don't want them choosing my school because I'm there. I want them to choose the school they can get through, because then they can do the work of building the profession too. And that's why I say they're first generation college students, first generation physicians, people who are underrepresented in medicine. We don't have the people who tell us how to apply to medical school, who tell us to take MCAT prep courses, who tell us to that if you want to go into engineering, you should do a pre-engineering summer program in high school. We don't learn these things until somebody teaches them to us. And so people who are without those resources have to do it all on their own. And because culturally, often we don't want to go to people and ask them for things. It's a limbo that people get stuck in. So I would say, remember that everybody started off not knowing anything.
Thank you very much for all of you for some really excellent advice. We're gonna, Dakota, I think I'm gonna turn it over to you for you to go ahead and do your next question, because I think that other question, we had a list of questions, and I think you already answered the one I was gonna ask. So Dakota, why don't you go ahead with your next question?
Okay. So this is a question, again, open to any of the panelists in any order, but what opportunities does your particular field provide, and what are some challenges that your particular field is facing?
So I think that the opportunities that the field I would like to go into provides is like really endless, and I'm still learning about all the different opportunities that go into being a physician, and I'm constantly learning new things. And it's also part of being first generation, and like I didn't even know how many different types of doctors there were out there, let alone after you become a doctor, all the different types of opportunities that come after that. So I think this profession is definitely very versatile, and it's definitely something you can make like you can make it your own and really make whatever kind of impact you want to make with it. And I definitely say some challenges that physicians face today is, I think, representation. And growing up, I never saw a female Native doctor. And that's a huge challenge, because I think that representation is so important in healthcare, and how we treat patients and build connections with patients in our communities, and just having that cultural competency. I don't think I've ever had a doctor that was very competent in the culture of my home community. And I think representation really is important in that. And I think that's a really big challenge that the healthcare field is facing right now.
Yeah. I'm not sure of like how to articulate opportunities in like wildlife disease. I would say like it's definitely somewhat of like a niche topic. It's become more expanded, like I mentioned before, especially like COVID-19, right? People have a lot more awareness of like, man, if animals are getting sick and then they're in contact with people, that can lead to bad stuff. So I think that's definitely been a push in the field of wildlife disease. But as far as like kind of just threats or challenges, I would probably say as far as tribal communities go in wildlife disease, it's probably like on the lowest of their topics, right? Probably number one is like trying to manage and steward these natural resources for the tribal community, especially for generations to come, dealing with, you know, pollutants or people trying to do things on your reservation that are not going to be environmentally friendly. And so they're structurally thin, right? They don't have large departments at all. And so I think that wildlife disease often gets pushed back because of that, even though wildlife disease is really important for managing like environmental health and species health. So that's kind of like what my passion is just like being able to find a balance where you can help like tribal natural resource managers like have the tools and the people and the manpower they need to like address and equip wildlife disease, so that way we can be, you know, taking steps and actions towards it. I forget the statistic, but there's a lot of natural land is on indigenous reservations in the US and even more like globally. So if we can really figure out a way and find people to prioritize wildlife disease on indigenous lands, I think that is a huge step for species conservation for future generations.
I think so. When we talk about challenges, sometimes we need to think of challenges as opportunities. So everything Bedoska says is right about the representation of Native people in medicine. There's an organization called Association of American Indian Physicians, which also has a medical student organization that's associated with it. And that's probably the single best place to find role models and to network and to actually get the same kind of experience that people who grow up in medicine in other cultures get. Because for a student, you can have as many aunties and uncles and grandpas and grandmas as you want, because there is one organization for Native people. And going to their meetings is always really about remembering that we're Native and bringing that to medicine. And so they have pre-college programs, they have high school programs, they have all kinds of things for people at various stages of their development. And it's a wonderful organization, and I strongly recommend anybody who's interested in getting into contact with them. It's a very welcoming group. And you might even see a movie star or two there, if depending on the meeting. So I think that is one of the biggest challenges for us. I think the other challenge is that as a society, not just Native people, but everybody is ill. We have an unhealthy society. That's great for me in terms of guaranteed work, but it's bad for everybody else. And I would rather it be better for everybody else. So I think we're starting to sort of rethink some of what we think about medicine, and trying to be more preventative and trying to be healthier. If people want to go into any specialty in medicine, there are opportunities. There aren't enough doctors. I will tell you that it's probably easier to get into medical school than it is to get into vet school or PA school, or probably a bunch of other professional schools, because now we have a lot of medical schools. But it's really important to not just get into one, but to get into one that fits, because that's the only way you can make it through. It's a very challenging time, and to get through it, you have to feel like you're at home.
Well, thank you so much. So the next question actually kind of dovetails off that a little bit. What improvements at MSU and resources would help Native American Indigenous students thrive in the university?
In the natural resources field, I think a big component is traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. If you've never heard of that, basically it is the concept or the idea that, like I've kind of mentioned throughout the talk, that Native Americans were the original natural resource managers of this land, and they have their techniques that are so much more I don't know what the right word is, I guess specific or niche, especially in certain areas to that climate or that terrain, and often that gets overlooked, especially in today's society, when it's easier to teach kind of like a blanket approach, especially in fisheries and wildlife and my degree there. So I'll definitely talk about traditional ecological knowledge a little bit more later, but for me, one thing that I am passionate about trying to start is I really want either all FW classes on a certain day every year, every semester, offer like a little TEK, blurb where professors get up there and just kind of share some sort of like department-wide lesson that, we can help generate, or even better would be to add some sort of Indigenous class that FW students have to take to graduate, to kind of recognize like inherent tribal partnerships when you go into the fisheries and wildlife profession. So those are some things like from kind of the natural resources side that I would really like to see from MSU. But in general, I'm sure that others will talk about this. It's just like continuing to just fund programs and clubs and things that bring us together and allow us to just have voices and kind of have communion, I guess, like Bidosuke was talking about with NASO. Like those kinds of opportunities are really fun and really critical. Like a bunch of Indigenous students can get together and it's always a really fun time. So just continuing to provide those in like different means is great in my opinion.
I agree. And that's something I actually never even thought about before, was like some type of instruction about Indigenous people. And now that I think about it, I didn't get any instruction in like, say, the arts and humanities classes or whatever you have to take in your undergrad that everybody has to take, no matter what your major is. Even in our orientation, there was never a mention about the tribal nations of Michigan and how Michigan State University is a land grant institution and there is a Michigan Indian tuition waiver. So it's huge. It's a really big deal that American Indians do have a presence at MSU, and it's not really taught about. So I think that's really important that Avery said, like just instruction on Indigenous people. But something I thought about was like, it's kind of not common knowledge that Indigenous people are very diverse. And I think a lot of the programming and resources we have are kind of like through a lens that we're all the same. And Indigenous people are very diverse, even in Michigan. A lot of people have different ties to their culture. A lot of people have different family cultures and histories, and even different tribes in Michigan have very different cultures and histories and traumas. And Michigan borders Canada, and there's a lot of Indigenous Canadian students at MSU. So there's just a lot of diversity. A lot of people do have different ties to their culture. Some are very involved in their traditions and cultures, and some are not. And I think like a lot of our resources and programming at MSU should be to help build upon the diversity of Indigenous people. And we're not all the same. We all come from different backgrounds. We all have different ties to our Indigenous lands. And I think a solution to that would just be like making diverse groups of people, like diverse students, faculty, staff, community members. There's a really big Indigenous community in inner city Lansing. I think that's like a solution to that problem, is just really a group of different people, faculty and staff included.
I'm really glad that you brought up the tuition waiver, because that should be front and center as part of the recruitment strategy for Michigan State as a whole. For many years, the state didn't actually honor the tuition waiver, but currently, as I understand it, I think they've even back paid some scholarships. And it has a presence on the state website, and they have a process for applying for it. And it can be used for professional school as well as for undergrad, as well as for community college and for technical training with state supported schools. And so it's absolutely essential. It is the birthright of all the Indigenous kids of this state. And actually, I think it can actually be used by people who are from out of state if they they meet the criteria once they establish residency in Michigan. So you can recruit somebody to come in and knowing that they only have to pay for tuition for 1 year, that makes it a whole lot better. And that would put us in a position to potentially really be leaders in educating our community, which I think all of us would really like to see happen.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Dakota for a question from one of our participants.
And our next question is, how can I support and amplify the voices of Indigenous students and colleagues?
I can field this one first. I would just say, like, I don't know, it's hard because, like, going back to like what Bodoske said, like, again, like very diverse, right, group of individuals. But I think there's definitely like certain opportunities, for example, like this month or Indigenous Peoples Day, kind of like I mentioned before, to make an acknowledgement of that in your classroom, what that looks like in your profession or the class you're teaching. Again, for like fisheries and wildlife, strong tribal connection there as far as like managing lands for natural resources. So lots of opportunities there. I would still think that there would be other opportunities in other STEM fields. Maybe it's highlighting a really cool Indigenous scientist in physics or in chemistry or whatever you're doing, to kind of bring that around. I would also say it's like offering to support, Indigenous student organizations if they reach out to you. I would say like that's something that's been really tough for me, is like if we try and get somebody to talk for us at or to help us at some sort of event, it's challenging whenever they reject or they say, no, I don't feel qualified. It's like, no, we would really appreciate you to like come and share and talk with their group, even if you're not Indigenous. So I think those are two big things for me, as well as just like educating yourself and, trying to learn more about different Michigan tribes. Or I always love when people are like, Avery, you're Cherokee, like that's not a Michigan tribe, right? Like where are you from? Like what's your history there? And I love just sharing a piece of my story, and that makes both of our day. And my goal is hopefully you walk away knowing a little bit more about the Cherokee. So I would just say little things like that can go a long way too.
I agree. And I really like that idea of highlighting Indigenous Peoples Day or Indigenous movements or Native American Heritage Month in your class. Even just a little spotlight, I think would make a huge difference. And not singling out your Indigenous students in your class, but like just highlighting it quickly, just so that we feel like our presence is known and that we are heard and we're not totally invisible. Because I think that invisibility really weighed heavy on me in my mental health in really big classes. And yeah, well, our topics are important. What our teachers are lecturing on, our professors are lecturing on, they're important. But I think just a little moment, maybe in the beginning of a lecture on an important Indigenous Day, would really help amplify us and our voices and help lift us up, even if it takes one little moment. But I think that would make a huge difference in making your Indigenous students feel proud and feel like they're heard. And also, I do like what he said about educating yourself. I think sometimes as Indigenous students, we feel the burden of educating everyone around us, but like educating yourself just a little bit, like a simple Google search or going out to a museum. There's plenty of museums I'm pretty sure every tribe has a museum. And I think the closest one to our campus is probably in Mount Pleasant. They have a beautiful museum at the Zeboing Center. And just educating yourself and just empowering your students just a little bit by opening your class on a special Indigenous Day or something with just a little sentence or a little acknowledgement, I think would be really, really good.
So I started working at Michigan State in 1998. And I was away from the university for a few years, but was always sort of connected. And for this year, for the first time I think I can ever recall, someone from the administration sent out an email about Orange Shirt Day, which is a day of remembrance for children who died or survived residential schools. And it's predominantly celebrated in Canada historically, but it's become more of a US thing as well. And we received an email from my dean, who is not Native, letting us know about it and what the history was. And I could never remember seeing anything like that coming from an upper administrator in a college or at the university in the more than 20 years I've been here. So that was a day that I really felt seen. And that was really amazing. I think that the reading of the land acknowledgement is a nice thing, because the first time people hear it, they're like, wait, what? And then after they've heard it a few times, then they start to realize, oh yeah, we probably ought to really be paying attention to that. And that helps to explain to them things like the tuition waiver and why it exists. But I think that ultimately, this goes back to what the opportunity is for the university. The opportunity for the university is to not pretend that we've all gone away, is to not think of us as creatures of the past, but to see us as human beings who exist now. And I don't think it's a lot to ask for that to be worked into curricula in every course. We're working on doing that in the curriculum in COM. And I think that it should absolutely be a part of the IAH series or part of the first year writing experience. I think those are places where it absolutely makes sense. I think that in an astronomy course, it might be a good thing for them to talk about John Harrington, the first Native astronaut. I think that it's worth it to talk about, in various places, people to be remembered for their contributions, just like we talk about other great people. And I think that we should be doing that for all communities. I think that tide can raise all of the boats.
We have time for one last question, and this is getting back to something that this is another question from one of our participants and getting back to something that Vidosky mentioned earlier, which is the fact that MSU is a land grant university. Do land grant universities have a particular responsibility or debt to Native American peoples in the Midwest, given that they were funded by the sale of lands taken from Native peoples?
You want me to jump on this one?
You're welcome to.
I'll take this one. Or you can, I'll say something real quick. I'm,
Please.
Not from, Michigan. My tribe is not either. So I'm definitely don't have the personal connections, but my opinion regardless is still that for sure there's more work to be done. Land acknowledgements are definitely great, like Dr. Senior was saying, but I think there's more. I think something everyone can do is read up on the history a little bit more. The question said land sale. I wouldn't even say that it was that terminology should probably even be used. I don't think it was that land was willingly sold at all. Selling land was a foreign concept to tribal communities anyways. People did not own land. It was jointly shared. So I think just like educating yourself too on like what the whole history behind the land grant university is like a critical piece in the puzzle too, to kind of figuring out that answer for yourself.
Dr. Sina, did you go ahead?
I have an old friend who retired from MSU, Phil Belfie. And what Phil would say is absolutely MSU does. And so does every other college. And so does every business. And so does every community. And so does every person who occupies this land. Now, I don't know if I would go quite that far, but I think the point is that when you're talking about a landmass that was occupied by, and probably Dr. Howard Babiwash could give me a better number than I can come up with, but I like the number 100 million indigenous people, and I'm willing to say that's in all of the Western landmass. And when we talk about all of the nations that are already recognized and the ones that aren't, and we talk about all the ones in Canada that are recognized and the ones that aren't, and when we talk about the indigenous people in Mexico and Central America and South America, and that legacy was taken away, and it wasn't taken away through kindness, and it wasn't taken away through gentle negotiation. It was taken. And one of the things that I think that all educational institutions have to do, and this is apparently a controversial concept, is that we have to remember history, and we have to try and teach it as accurately as possible, not just for Native people, but for everybody. Because if we sanitize it, then we're going to have generations that have no idea what legacy has been handed down to them. And that will never be good for anybody.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. And looking at the time, we did have one more question we were going to ask, but I think we've run out of time. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Benton for our closing remarks. And thank you again to all your panelists, and Dakota as our moderator. Really appreciate your time today.
Are you sure we don't have time for the question, Kendra? Like, can we squeeze it in? I was gonna say, maybe if we could squeeze it in quickly.
Okay. Sure. The last question was from a participant. And it was, I'm interested in learning about the ways that Indigenous communities take care of the environment and understanding the scientific reasoning behind these practices. What suggestions do you have for how I can bring knowledge about these practices into the classes I teach? And I know Avery had to leave a little bit early, so if Bidoske or Red Dog, if you have, either of you have something you'd like to share for that.
It's really too bad Avery left, because that's totally his thing. There are lots of books that cover these types of materials. There are books on native science. There are books on soft technologies and indigenous knowledge. I think that the knock against them has always been that they weren't considered rigorous enough by the American research standards. And I think that as a result, they get pushed to the side rather than being seen for what they offer. And you know, if you want to expand science and technology in any way, you have to look to shifting paradigms, because then you can reconfigure and reconceive the same things you're working with and see them in a different way. And I think that from that standpoint, native science should be taught to some extent in all STEM courses.
Yeah, I think that Indigenous communities take care of their environment and their people in a very different way than Western norms, Western societal norms. And I think in order to understand that, you have to like kind of neglect everything you know about Western society norms, and you have to really look at it through an Indigenous perspective to understand the Indigenous reasons behind it and the scientific reasoning behind it, because it is intertwined. And I think to teach it, you have to learn it in a really indigenous way. And I think that's difficult, but
Let me add one more thing. And that is that the fundamental basis of Western science is the separation of humankind from nature and from the natural world. And the fundamental basis of indigenous science is that we are part of and responsible for the world around us. And so when you conceive of science from a participatory and survival perspective, as opposed to a resource development perspective, that's going to shift things pretty significantly, especially technologically.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Benton, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. This was a really great. I feel like our time together flew by very quickly, and I feel like there's so many other things I feel like we could even chat about from the things that you have shared. I think that one of the biggest takeaways is just the diversity of your experience, and I feel like that's something that is a recurring theme that's coming up in our series. We had Hispanic and Latinx Heritage Month. We celebrated that last month, but we're all intricately linked because there's indigenous communities when we think about Latin America and the diversity just within indigenous communities. And so I love this series because I think it brings out that people are not one thing, and people may have shared identities, but there's also diversity within that. And so I thank you for all your insight that you have shared with us tonight. And so with that being said, I just want to thank you for your time, sharing your perspective and being so generous with the information you shared with us. I hope we all, like I said at the beginning, I hope we all learned something and how we can go on and be better in this world. We do plan to have more Amplify NatSci series in spring semester. This is our last one, but we hope that you all who came here tonight will stay tuned for our upcoming series in spring semester. And so with that being said, I'm going to ask Kendra to play some music for us, and we will close out our program. Thank you again, everyone, for coming tonight.
Miigwech.